Hello, and welcome to Catholicism Isn't Scary. I'm your host, Jana Russell. I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, became a Protestant as an adult for about a year and a half, and then became Catholic. If you can hear in my voice today that I sound a little off, it's because I have strep throat. I thought, however, that since I'm on bed rest pretty much anyways, I still wanted to get something done. Our topic for today is the Reformation and the Jehovah's Witness end times. A prominent feature about the Jehovah's Witnesses is their ability to always know when the end is nigh. If you know anything about the Witnesses, you know their initial end date for the world was 1914. When that date came and went, they apparently adjusted their understanding about what it really meant. Or you might know that there had been a saying among Jehovah's Witnesses to stay alive till 1975, because that was going to be the real end of the world. Many people at that time actually sold their houses, cars, valuables, and quit their jobs even. But that came and went too. I was a Jehovah's Witness from 1993 to 2022, and while I had never heard of a precise date being given, we assessed the nearness by the end of other things. A circuit overseer once told a pioneer I knew that we did not have 50 years left in the system. That excited us. Everyone knew the governing body members were also growing seriously old. And if they were the generation that were born while some of the generation that lived through 1914 was still alive, then them growing old and dying must mean the end was around the corner too. But I digress. Why? Why is this so ingrained in Watchtower doctrine? The answer to this has to do with something much before the Watchtower, or even the Bible students, for that matter, ever got started. The answer actually lies squarely in the lap of the so-called Protestant Reformation. So let's start there. In his book, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, Martin Luther wrote, and I quote, that the papacy is truly the kingdom of Babylon and the very Antichrist. For who is the man of sin and the son of perdition, but he who with his doctrines and laws increases the sins and perditions of souls in the church, while sitting in the church as if he were God? All this the papal tyranny has fulfilled, and more than fulfilled, these many centuries. Now, after centuries of this kind of rhetoric, maybe it doesn't sound too shocking to us. I know as a Jehovah's Witness, I heard that Christendom, and very particularly the Catholic Church, was the whore of Babylon since I was a baby. I have heard Protestant teachers proclaim very similar things, so it's not surprising to hear. However, the scale on which Martin Luther was able to popularize this idea became revolutionary at its time. Instead of being confined to small sporadic heretical groups throughout time, this became one of the very defining factors in the outbursting of Protestantism. The 1647 Westminster Confession even clearly labeled the Pope as the Antichrist. It's since been changed. It was changed in 1903, but the original language showed the true thoughts of the time. An article on Crossway's website by J.V. Fesco, professor of systematic and historical theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, explained the reasoning at the time like this. Protestant theologians believe that they were engaged in the final battle of the ages, the battle of Antichrist against the Church of Christ. They sought, therefore, to protect the Church from the perceived threat and declared that the Pope was the Antichrist. This opinion was quite common and met with little dissent. Why such a bold claim at the time? Well, to make that claim was to give credence to the idea that a split from the Church was necessary. These days, schisms and churches breaking up are often seen as little more than unfortunate or inconvenient. When people leave a church to attend a different flavor of church, it's not seen as something inherently wrong. I remember talking to one Protestant elder who was explaining to me how he had ran many house churches in the past, but that this last one he had deteriorated and then ended. I said I was sorry to hear that. But he said not to be sorry about it at all. That's just how house churches were. They ran their course and broke up and ended due to many factors. I remember thinking that this was incredibly odd when I was listening to it. And historically speaking, it is. Historically, schism was seen as extremely sinful and damning. But If people were convinced that the Pope was the Antichrist, then maybe it could be licit, or even in their minds necessary. As Luther capitulated, we are not splitting from the church, but the abominations that have possession of the holy places. We are the true church, the one which has been cast out and is suffering persecution. But this same bold claim justifying splits and schisms was the one that also led logically to end-time predictions. It's reported that even Luther himself at least hinted that the end of the world might come by 1600, although he was unwilling to set specific dates to his credit. Think of it this way, though. If you are really living at the time of the Antichrist, this must mean Christ's return is imminent, right? And that's exactly what kind of fervor the Protestants had. Now compound the Antichrist end times fervor with something else revolutionary, the doctrine of sola scriptura, and you're going to get some wild results. I mean, right off the bat, Luther seemed to acknowledge that it wasn't exactly easy to understand some things in the Bible or even entire books of the Bible. He said Revelation should reveal, but because the book of Revelation was so complicated, Christ was neither taught or known in it. Here's one direct quote from Luther on this topic. About this book of Revelation of John, I leave everyone free to hold his own opinions. I would not have anyone bound to my opinion or judgment. I say what I feel. I miss more than one thing in this book, and it makes me consider it to be neither apostolic nor prophetic. That's found in his preface to Revelation from 1522. Despite all this, though, Daniel and Revelation were becoming widely available for private use due to printing, and Protestant groups began interpreting these complex texts in all kinds of new ways. The church became the whore of Babylon out of Revelation. Daniel 11 became about predicting the future about this church being the Antichrist and the imminent return of Christ. The Anabaptist Protestants had a tendency to become even more extreme and specific in their interpretations. Some set dates and even attempted to foist their own imaginings on people around them. One such person was Melchior Hoffman, who set an end date prediction that, of course, came and went. His successor declared the city of Munster to be the New Jerusalem, and that he was king over it, being a descendant of King David, and that Jesus would be returning promptly. If you don't know that story, you should definitely look it up. It is crazy. Well, all this date setting and predicting never actually ceased in the Protestant world, though. It continued to revive and disappoint throughout the centuries. Why? It's because the same fundamentals it was built on then linger today. Personal interpretations in a sola scriptura framework, and in many cases, the remaining fear of Catholicism. Specifically, for the sake of our argument, though, we'll now zero in on the Millerites. The Millerites were people who followed William Miller. William Miller was a Baptist preacher in the U.S. who spent many years in study over Daniel and Revelation himself. He eventually concluded, using specific verses and literal calculations, that the end would come around 1843. Of course, that didn't happen, so he adjusted it to 1844. But when that didn't happen either, people were disappointed. In fact, you might have heard of it. It's called the Great Disappointment. Out of the Great Disappointment came many Adventist groups, keenly interested in the end times as well. And the founder of the Watchtower, Charles Taze Russell, built on those foundations. He was heavily influenced by people like William Miller and the Adventists that surrounded him at the time. He too used literal calculations and a mashup of Daniel, Revelation, Ezekiel, Luke, and Numbers to conclude that 1914 was the real date. Of course, as usual, none of it materialized, so that got changed to, instead of Jesus coming visibly, he just returned invisibly. And that doctrine remains down to this day in the Watchtower. In any case, we can blame Charles Taze Russell for his whack predictions, but at the same time, he just bore the lens that had gone before him from his Adventist and Millerite forefathers. And that lens is not totally dissimilar from his Protestant cousins today, actually. Before all of them, we may trace up to the many Anabaptists who were revolutionary in their interpretation and application of Scripture, and before them, Luther, who helped birth and popularize the idea that everyone was living at the time of the Antichrist, and that Christ's return was imminent because of the Pope, and that the doctrine of sola scriptura was necessary. A person with a JW background cannot fail to observe the similarities here and link all these things down through the ages. It's all too real. Protestant groups today can try to minimize the impact of the Reformation on all of it, but the fact remains. The Watchtower was built on Protestantism. Jehovah's Witness leaders get away with failed predictions and prophecies and constant doctrine shifting by repeating, "We are not infallible." But this sounded so familiar to me. I was hearing that all the time. Did the preacher change his tune? Well, he wasn't infallible. Did we just flip-flop our doctrine in our Protestant church? Well, we were never infallible. Was Luther correct? It doesn't matter because he wasn't infallible. Was the Westminster Confession wrong in labeling the Pope as the Antichrist? No big deal. It was never infallible. Are the Jehovah's Witnesses then wrong about the end? Were they wrong? Well, it's okay because they're infallible too. You see how that works? The Crossway article I mentioned earlier defends the Westminster flip-flop this way. As much as we might raise our eyebrows at such firm convictions about the identity of the Antichrist, we have something to learn from these past events. While we might not worry about theology becoming violent warfare and have the luxury of discussing and debating eternal matters without much fear, we should recognize that theology matters. The deeper problem with that is that the convictions we just raise our eyebrows at today are convictions that were actually applied in the past. Convictions that impacted our societies and our ancestors deeply. If theology matters, it always matters. And one wrong prediction or failed prophecy is not just something to simply raise our eyebrows at. It means that those people were false prophets. If Luther and the Westminster Confession preached something so pivotively wrong, preaching the identity of the Antichrist incorrectly, then they are false prophets by definition, just as Charles Taze Russell and the Jehovah's Witness governing body are. They use their fallibility as an excuse for their authority, having led people down wrong paths, into failed predictions, and to false doctrines. But Jesus calls false prophets ravenous wolves. They prophesied the delusions of their own minds, as Jeremiah put it about false prophets. We have to stay logically consistent. Therefore, all of them should be rejected. Thanks for listening, and I hope you come back. And remember, Catholicism isn't scary.